Hello, so today is going to be a two-part video. Today is going to be part one of that two-part video. I just wanted to go over the decks that I worked with this winter. You know, a little traditional style, just go through the decks and all that. And then in part two, I'm going to hopefully not have cat hair in my lip gloss and speak to practice and how I worked with those decks a bit more. And how I journal and that kind of stuff, because that sort of content really helped me early on, and I still really enjoy that kind of content. So if you're into that, stay tuned for that part, and do let me know if you have questions about it in the comments below. I might be filming that tonight, so might not get to everything asked. If there are things asked, you know, I'll just get to them in other videos. But at any rate, let's get flipped around and look at the decks. Alright, so the first set of decks, hopefully I can move through fairly quickly. I've spoken about these two before, but since we're covering all the decks I worked with this winter, and that's several months of working, these have been a pretty staple piece in the practice here and there. Like I've mentioned elsewhere, but in case anyone's new here and unfamiliar, for me, these have really shown up as grief work decks, and that is the Death Doula Oracle here in the center and Tarot of the Sweet Fool on the sides. So both of these decks I saw on Shanna D's channel. She did a video a while back that they were a pairing that she really loved and found in her collection. And I was immediately hooked. And while both of these had been on my radar somewhat, I had sort of written them off as decks that I wouldn't really know what to do with. You know, even though I had worked with decks that veer off the path of traditional, or even totally on their own path, these ones, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to connect with them. And I found it hard to really see how I would looking at them through a screen. Definitely seeing them in person is what kind of changed the game for me with these. But what sort of ended up happening was I got these, I did an interview type spread with the two of them, and immediately felt like a really good connection with them, but then it just cut off. It was strange. I was like, man, that first reading came through so clear, but then the next couple times I tried to work with it, the two of them anyway, I just was sort of like, that is not hitting for me. These are going to take a little bit of time to really get comfortable with. And then a few months, I think it was just like a month or so later, was when my brother passed away. And for a while, I didn't know what to do with cards. That wasn't really on my mind. But then it got to a point where I really needed a place of solace, and I wanted to get back into my journaling practice and work through a lot of the complex emotions and things that were coming up, and the grief in general. And I started pulling from this deck, and I'm going to make a more dedicated video about them, so I won't go too far into it, but this was the first card that came through, and it showed up repeatedly the first week or two. And I just stuck with Death Doula for a minute, just for a message of guidance for that given day, something to orient my mind on. And the idea of being malleable in difficult times and what that can mean spiritually really spoke to me and really helped me. It did take pulling it, like the 3 times I pulled it, to really understand what it would mean to be malleable in a situation like that. But once I did, I got more comfortable and started pulling in the tarot deck. And Tarot the Sweet Fool, I feel like if you're seeing it on camera and you're used to traditional decks, it kind of is like, what in the world is that? But I just found it to become such an intuitive deck. And I don't know that I can explain how or why, because a lot of the images are so abstract that it sort of looks like, what is that? What's going on? What's the emotion? Blah, blah, blah. But I've really found over time working with these two that they just slot into that place where when I'm feeling really emotionally distraught, these are the decks I turn to. I think having the lack of human figure, of course they say that and this one shows up, but it's like one of two maybe cards that feature like an actual human face between both of these. But that sort of liminal space of this abstract photography, I just found to be very comforting because I was not ready to be working with decks that were showing me people and things like that. I was in a liminal space myself, and navigating that with these two, they stay on my altar. I pull them out when I feel like dipping back into that, and they give me that, and the practice around them give me a safe place to really dip into the grief without dipping too far, so to speak, or dipping too into the negative, to see the more spiritual side of things and the perspective of how to grow, how to integrate all of that good stuff. I didn't even pay attention if these were in screen very well, so I'm gonna have to adjust things, I guess. But at any rate, they've just really served a very meaningful purpose. I would not want to be without either of these decks. And I'll get more into the actual practice of how I personally worked with them, both in terms of sort of a spread that wound up kind of developing through them, as well as the general practice in a later video. That's going to be a more dedicated thing when I feel up to sharing that. But I did want to show them because they have been a mainstay where almost pretty much every week there's a point where I feel like dipping into them and reflecting on things. So that is Remembering the Sweet Fool Tarot and Death Doula. So these next three decks I wound up working with together. Something that came through for me, the end of summer, was this nudge to work with Persephone, but I got the very clear message that that was going to happen in the winter. The message specifically was, in the winter we descend, and that took on all kinds of meanings with the things that have been going on. But I wound up, I had this deck, Tarot of Persephone's Garden. I had gotten it when Tarot of the Huntress came out because I didn't want to miss out on it. I wasn't sure if I was going to work with it because I've always worked with Artemis. But anyway, there wound up being a sort of handoff, let's say. And I wound up searching for oracle decks that would pair with this. I had previously started working with Persephone a little bit with Hush Tarot and the Honasa House deck, and I think it was the Lost Oracle. But as the descent was descending, it felt like there was something that needed to, a way that we needed to go deeper. And this deck, I didn't have something that I felt was the right piece to go with it, like the right kind of messaging or energy or whatnot. So I wound up finding the Divine Nature Oracle. I did a walkthrough when I initially got it because it just seemed to have the kinds of messages in it that I felt encompassed both guidance, but also getting into some of the deeper aspects of things. And then I wound up wanting something that was even more gritty for more of the shadow work type stuff. And Dark Mirror just really stood out to me. It really spoke to me as a deck that was going to do that. But also the types of messages, again, really spoke to me. Now, the thing was, though, I went looking for it, saw it was on sale at Llewellyn, didn't hop on the sale, and was like, okay, I'll just catch it on the next one. Because I do try to contain myself until there is a sale. But then when I went looking again the next time around, it wasn't there. And lo and behold, it has gone out of print. I did manage to find my copy on thrift books. I don't imagine it's the most difficult thing to find, but, it's just recently out of print. But something that I like about it, with this sort of imagery it has, initially seeing it, I was like, man, that's a lot of border stuff going on. But given that it does lean more into confronting things, it's sort of nice to be looking at it through a window and feeling this sense of peering into a window, but not being immersed on the other side. Don't know if that makes sense, but for a shadow work type of thing where it's going to bring up stuff that's a little more confronting, stuff you might not, you kind of have to be in the right space to look at. Having that frame around it, and then also the moon phases referencing different aspects of processing sort of grief in a way, really just, it felt like the right move. And the three of these decks and how they've come to work together have really, I don't know if you can call it a bonded pair. It's a bonded triplet for me, I guess is what I'll say. But these were the three decks I was working with outside of working through grief, to try and get a little deeper into the things that I was being called to explore this winter season. I think I'm still I don't feel ready to be, I'm not done with these, even though it's officially past Ostara and spring is coming. And in some sense, I would like to shift a little bit more into lighter things, because with these three decks, I have much more been working on a level of taking quite a while to process readings rather than feeling the need to pull cards every day. I'm still sitting with the cards, but I might let a spread linger and add more to my journaling with it across the span of a week, or, sit with those cards, and then maybe a few days into sitting with them, I realize something else I need to dig into. And so I'll expand the spread or whatever to dig a little more into it once I feel comfortable to. That kind of a thing. I'll talk more about that in the actual practice part, because I do want to share that kind of stuff on my channel. It's not in any way ever going to be directive. It's just sharing how I worked, and if it inspires you to try something and add something or tweak something in your practice, then awesome. That's kind of the goal. I know that helped me a lot when I was starting to work with cards, was to see how other people worked with them and really get a sense of it, because I just wasn't sure. At first it was just this ambiguous thing. But what I'll say with Divine Nature Oracle is that this has become more of a, this one I turn to for guidance, but also there are cards like this, Submerge, this was the last one I pulled actually, that kind of call you to look a little deeper into things, or surrender the resistance, and a lot of times, I'll get more into depth into this, but basically I would pull a card from this and have it start as my directive of where to go next with the reading. So surrender the resistance might prompt me to be like, okay, let me grab Tarot of Persephone's Garden and pull a card for what is it I'm resisting and what's beneath the resistance, or what does letting go look like, or whatever comes up. The different cards prompt different things, and a lot of the times was allowing it to just unfold in that way. And then Dark Mirror would be more of the, all right, what's the gritty thing here that I need to look at? What's underneath all of it? So I'll talk more about that when we get into the actual practice stuff and sort of show you. I just want to mention this card because there was one point in the last like 6 to 8 weeks where I just felt so off with my intuition. I felt so disconnected, and I didn't know, I still kind of don't know what exactly it was. It could also be related to health stuff, but this card came up when I first got this deck. It was like the first one I pulled for journaling. And yeah, I couldn't come up with an image that better described how I felt. Colorless angel, like that just, it fit so, it gave me words, or it gave me something to tap into to describe what I was actually feeling in a more tangible way, which did help me move through that period and reconnect. So those three were my go-to Persephone working decks. There is one more I will mention before I get on to the next deck, which is one that I almost rehomed, or I was considering it because I just wasn't sure after I got it in that I was ever going to be able to connect with it. It sat on my desk in order, like I didn't even shuffle it for a couple months, because while I was drawn to it, I was just like, I don't know if you and I are going to ever connect. Long story short, we did, but I'll get to that. The other last deck that I would say was part of the Persephone practice was the Lantern Oracle. So this one is described as a shadow work deck. I'm going to say I didn't work with it in depth in one sense, but in another sense, what I wound up doing was just pulling basically a card a week. It wasn't, always on a Sunday or something, but just when I felt like it was time to move on from that particular card, it felt like the work had been done there, I would pull a card. And at first when I was doing this, it wasn't with the intention of having it influence or play a role in the readings that I was doing with Persephone. But I realized as things went along, because I would pull this, a card and keep it on my altar propped up in a holder, and it would just live there until it felt like time to pull a different one. And I realized that my readings during the time that a particular card was up were tying into the message that was in this card. So that was really cool. I wouldn't say I worked in depth with it because I was just pulling a card occasionally. It was only a handful of cards over the course of, a couple months, but that was a really interesting aspect of this whole practice this past winter, was that sort of serendipitously working out that way. I have my current cards still out on my altar, and I sort of just leave it up there, and I don't try to force the readings I end up doing with the other three decks in any way to be about the subject of this card, but it kind of keeps winding up that way, which is pretty neat, pretty interesting. This is also just like such beautiful artwork. I think it's really one of the most beautiful detailed artwork decks that I have. That's what drew it to me. I mean, they look like gorgeous oil paintings. I don't know what the actual medium is. I don't remember, but gorgeous. And the guidebook goes into depth with the cards, but the way that they are, you can read and use them intuitively if you prefer, because you've got the card title and then a phrase. And the artwork is also in itself just very evocative. So, beautiful deck. Really enjoyed working with this one. Again, I think I'm keeping these guys all out because I don't necessarily feel done. I do want to get back to something a little lighter because sometimes I get hit pretty hard. So let's get on to the deck that made me question everything. I have never gotten in a deck and decided to rehome it. I've never gotten in a deck and felt like there was no chance I was going to connect with it. But this one really had me feeling that way for a moment. And that is Tarot Obscuro. This is one of those weird and wonderful decks, and I loved it for that. That's why I got it. But when I had it in hand and was flipping through the images, I was like, Ooh, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to connect with her. Or him, as it kind of has turned out to be. So this deck lived on my desk for quite a while in order, and I didn't know what to do with it. I would flip through it now and again. I would stick and land on images that I kind of like. These two, fine enough, but there's some of them where, like, Three of Pentacles, where I just was like, I'm not sure I get it. I'm not sure I can tap into the imagery or feel resonance. But what wound up happening was this one evening, I was trying to work out some prompts. Like I said, with the Persephone work, I was most of the time allowing it to unfold, but there would be threads of things that would come up, particularly with the first sort of initiation reading, let's call it, which I may or may not post a deck diary about. I haven't decided yet. I recorded it, but I don't know, I have to see how I feel. But in that reading, a thread came up that was sort of directing me to the point of our work this season. And that very much has carried through. And part of that, I was trying to come up with prompts. It was a whole long story. Anyway, so I wanted to test the prompts. And the deck that was closest to me was this one. I had other ones that I could have grabbed, but for some reason I was just like, screw it. Let's just shuffle this one and see where it goes. And I was pretty stunned, because it very quickly, I'll just flip some cards for you so you can get a feel. The second card started landing on the table. I felt what I thought I wouldn't, number one. And number two, it suddenly occurred to me that this was a Hades deck. Now, the Oracle deck I put at the center of this is Oracle d'Or. These are the backs if you like to see how these types of things look. I got this with the Lonely Dreamer Tarot. It's a beautiful shadow worky deck. So from subject matter, they paired well, but also visually, I think they work really nicely together. They have worked nicely together. But that first reading I did with it, I just used a Tarot Obscuro alone. I didn't expand on it with this. I just sank into this and very much distinctly got that feeling of, oh, this is a Hades deck. I had sort of gotten the energy of his presence, but I figured, well, I'm talking to Persephone in a sense, working with her. Makes sense that I would feel that. But I didn't anticipate we were going to work together. I've never worked with a male deity or been drawn to any in particular. But the way that this all worked out was just a unique experience, and the style of working, or the style of how the shadow work goes, working with these or his energy, or however you want to think of it, was just so interesting because it was very different. Like, Persephone has a different energy to me, and the sort of comfort or warmth I felt around the readings with her was very distinct from these. And of course, visually, these are a very different world. But it was just a unique experience. I don't know how deep I want to go into it, but to say I have worked with these decks more, but it's very much for specific types of readings or a follow-up to where I start with Persephone on a subject, and then I want to dig into some things with Hades, which, as it so happens, I swear to you, like, is this not him? As I was going through the deck, it didn't really occur to me right away. I sort of thought, like, that King of Cups kind of stands out to me for some reason and feels like a familiar energy. And then when I had that connection that night and wound up looking through the deck, I was like, that feels like his energy, like both from the standpoint of King of Cups, but also this artwork. Like, it just was very interesting. So I've kept this card out at times as a significator when it's felt relevant to do so. It's just been an interesting experience, but I can't say, that I worked with this deck so in depth because it is limited to certain kinds of work that I'm not trying to pull cards like every day on a daily basis, because I just, it's a lot to process when you're doing shadow work and trying to figure these things out. but every time I have turned to it, even cards that I thought wouldn't make sense to me, they would land and I'd be like, oh, I get it. How strange. So I'm just going to keep allowing that to unfold as it does. And Oracle d'Or, to me, has read more of the looking at the actual psychological complex. And this is what I mean when I kind of end up associating Hades with that King of Cups energy, because there's this sense of a sensitivity, but there's also critical examination. That kind of is King of Cups to me, because it's that combination of swords and, or I should say air and water is how I view the kings, as their base element as being air. So King of Swords would be air of air, very heady, intellectual. We're not talking about emotions with this guy, and why would you want to? I mean, look at him. But for strategic planning, he might be your dude. It just depends. The other funny thing I want to mention, since this card's coming up, maybe I'll pop up some pictures of this, but there was this really interesting point where I was getting these synchronicities between both Tarot of Persephone's Garden and Tarot Obscuro, where I kept getting High Priestess above, Ten of Cups below. I knew what it was in relationship to. It was kind of funny. When it first came up, it was kind of funny, but it was seriously, like, it came up at one point, and then there was a reading or two where it didn't. And then for external reasons, that sort of subject was brought up. And then when I turned to the cards, it was like, boom, 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 High Priestess, Ten of Cups below. Because the way that I am generally pulling cards, again, I'll get more into this stuff when I'm in the practice portion of things, but the way that I'm generally pulling for shorter spreads, where it's sort of more of a daily thing, or let's just see where this goes, or a single question type thing, is to pull as above, so below. So the top card and the bottom card. So that combination came up like 3 or 4 times, mostly this deck, but then it also showed up in this deck the next time I had pulled from it. And I was kind of mind blown by that. And then it was really funny because I got a Kickstarter deck in. And, you know, I was just playing around with it. It was definitely not a shadow worky type deck for me. And the first above and below pull I did with it, I think I have a picture of it, was actually the reverse. It was 10 of Cups, High Priestess below. And that was literally in that string of days where it was just back to back every time I pulled. That's what I was getting. And I just kind of put everything down and was like, all right, noted. Gonna journal real deep about this, because clearly I need to explore, face, and dive into what that might mean for me. That was really funny. And I don't know, you can't, you know, stuff happens where you're like, yeah, I wouldn't believe that unless it happened to me, and then it did, and here we are. Okay, one last thing I want to mention. There's this Kickstarter. Look, I'm trying to be good, but I saw this Kickstarter and I want to show you, because I think I can do it with the way the images are, how it looks with Tarot of Persephone's Garden, because it just has a handful of days left. It's close to being fully funded. It's not quite there yet. So I want to mention it because I'm going to be really sad if it doesn't get funded. Just in case it speaks to anyone. Hopefully I have figured out a way to throw up the images here so you can kind of see them with this deck. Sorry about the cat. Echo is very disgruntled about her ever so late dinner. At any rate, I'm going to link this probably at the top of the description in the video if you want to check it out. I just think the Oraculum is what it's called. I think it looks like it'll be a very interesting deck. I really like the artwork and the cards that I've seen, the idea behind it, and I think it would tie in rather beautifully with Persephone work. So of course I would really love to get it. And I just wanted to give it a little bit of a shout out and see how it looks paired, because other than my own mind's eye, I haven't seen it yet either. So you and I are watching it in real time, loosely, of course, because I'm kind of editing it in. Anyway, doesn't matter. Point is, I just wanted to shout out this campaign because I think it looks like a really beautiful deck. I also don't even have a round deck in my collection at the moment, so I'm curious about that. Also, the proportions. I have no idea what the proportions are, so don't judge based off of what I'm doing here. This is my guesstimation playing out. Anyway, let's get back to the main video. I just wanted to shout this one out and throw the link out there and support a small creator in making a project happen, hopefully, because it looks like it would be a very beautiful deck and a meaningful one as well. So the last, you know what? At this point, I'm going to go into the books, actually. One second. Okay, so there's a handful of books I want to talk about. This one we'll get to last because I read that when I was a kid, or it was read to me, I should say, but it becomes relevant for another reason. As far as Persephone goes, these were the two books I had gotten. They both come at the topic of Persephone from a different place to me. I sort of wish I had started with this one, but it wound up being something of divine timing for me not to, and I'll get to that when we talk about it. But I started with this one, which is a very good book. It leans more into talking about the practice of working with her and just overviews of why is this so wonky? Overviews of working with her from the perspective of someone who has for a good amount of time and has experience to share with that, and talking about in general, deity connection. I don't know if worship is the right word, but I guess these post-it notes or whatever these are, these little tabs don't have as much grip as they should. Anyway, this is a really good book, but I do find it to be a little bit more of an overview of practice. It does talk about myth, and it does talk about, if we go to the, what is this? The contents, you can see here what they are. It does talk about these 6 seeds of sort of topics or themes or lessons related to Persephone that sort of stand at the forefront of her and her myth and working with her. So it goes through all of that. It goes through creating an altar. It's a good book for someone who's new to working with deities and wants some touch points on working with her, on developing intuition. There's an oil recipe in here, and a lot of it is talking about, some divination, like these are all symbols you can carve into your own rune stones, basically. There's a lot of cool stuff like that. There's also tarot spreads. I didn't wind up working with them because I had a whole bunch that I had sort of come up with for myself prior that also were a lot more specific to the work that I felt I was called to be doing with her. But this was a really good book. It's a lot more of a reference book than I kind of, by this point in it, was a bit like, all right, let me just skim through the rest of it, because what I really wanted to get at is more what is in this book by Pagan Portals, Persephone Practicing the Art of Personal Power. This is a very slim book, but don't let its slimness make you think that this isn't really deep, because it is. In the way that it's written, it's much more about talking to the myth, but also the meaning. I'm trying to think what the best way to describe would be. How to say. Let me start with the introduction of how this book even became a prominent thing in my practice. I mentioned before, I sort of had an initiatory reading working with Persephone, and that was using Tarot of Persephone's Garden and Divine Nature Oracle when it came in. I finally felt like I had the Oracle deck that I wanted to work with this tarot, because I just personally like having Oracle and Tarot. I have in my work with Artemis, the other deck by Kara Small, Tarot of the Huntress, that's dedicated to her, of course. And then I use Witch Oracle, which is also by US Games, like Divine Nature is. And for me, that is very much Artemis themed in a way, very sovereign, be your own woman, independent of, social influence and whatnot. These 2 decks were that for me. I wanted to find that same kind of pair, and it just so happened that US Games had this one, and that fits the place for me. So it's also kind of nice because it's like it just matches up with the Witch Oracle. But I had used those for my initiatory reading, and in that reading, the keystone card of it, 7 of Cups, among everything else, was very strongly giving me this message of cultivating discernment. And that relates a lot to a lot of emotional confusion I have felt in the last year. So that felt like, yeah, all right, cool. We're going to dive into that. Great. Felt a little called out, but also like, yeah, I get you. Like, that does need to be looked at. When I got this book in the mail, it was literally the day that I recorded the video of that reading. And it was a larger reading, so I had sat with it. I had expanded it over time. I had already been with that reading for a bit, but when I sat to record it, I had sort of synthesized all my thoughts of, those cards, and that 7 of Cups being the keystone to that reading. So this came in the mail as I'm filming that, and I open, or on the day I was filming that, used from shipping from I don't know where, I don't know when. It took a long time to get here. It just happened to arrive that day. And when I open to the contents, I see Chapter 5, Persephone and the Art of Discernment, which I had not come across, this idea of Persephone being very tied to this idea of discernment. So of course that fascinated me. And I went straight to that chapter. And I think for that video, I'd only read through this part. But later, I've since read this whole chapter, and it's not that long. I mean, it basically goes to this page here from 58 to 62, and then it goes into a divination technique that I should probably still give a go. But reading this was surreal because it sums up the entirety of that reading in such an interesting way that I was like, is this happening? Like, this is crazy. It's talking about wielding one's personal power, discernment defined as the ability to judge well, and the key card coming up, the dragon I needed to face, so to speak, in that spread was judgment. It talks about the sun, and all these things were literally the cards that showed up practically were being referenced, at least archetypally, in these few pages. And I don't know, blew my mind. So I am in the midst of reading it now because I finally finished Persephone's Pathways. I've kind of been dipping into a few different books, and I'm somewhat of a slow, undisciplined reader. So that's something I'd like to work on. But at any rate, this is the one I'm dipping into most now, and I really enjoy it. It really speaks more in depth. There's also these journaling prompts. Like, there's all kinds of ways to play with this that you could incorporate into card work, or think about the subjects in terms of how you can work cards around them for your own growth, to be able to learn from Persephone and her story, and how that all manifests, right, in different ways for different people. So I really recommend this one. Also, Persephone's Pathway. That one I feel is more a good guidebook or a reference book for practice or that sort of thing. And like I said, it has things like how to craft oils and whatever. I wound up coming up with my own intuitive recipe, if you will, and my own correspondences, because for me that just feels right when I'm connecting with a deity. And I also needed to work with what I had on hand and could order, and what felt right, The last book I'll briefly mention because it's going to be featured largely in the grief videos that eventually I'll probably do. But this book, Sacred Tears, A Witch's Guide to Grief by Courtney Weber, was of great solace to me. And I started reading it, again, just like the 2 decks, Death Doula and Tarot of the Sweet Fool, which I had just happened to get a couple months prior to all of that. This book was also one that the algorithm on Amazon was like, here, look at this. And I saw it, and knew like that was something I need to get. Grief is something I've struggled with in the past, and also it's something that is very much a part of life. At one point she does even talk about tarot. She might even talk about temperance, or maybe that was me associating temperance with a later part of the book. But her talking about the Wheel of Fortune or grief as a spiral, and just in general, her reflections on grief and experiencing loss and moving through it as someone who's spiritual, who, of course you lose someone, especially unexpectedly, it brings into question everything, right? And it just so happened my card of the year last year was Wheel of Fortune. I forget what my brother's was. I'd have to double check. But at any rate, this book really helped me process. And it felt like a place of solace to turn to, where someone really understood and put into words the cycles of what I felt I was going through. I've since gifted it to a friend even, because it just was very valuable to me in that. So I want to mention it. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about it in the grief series, or I'll just mention it again. So those were the books. And the last one that I want to mention is this copy of The Secret Garden. My dad gifted this to me when we were out on a bonding trip running errands. And I love this book. This is one my mom read to me when I was little, and I wanted to have a copy because I'm not sure where that copy wound up. And this is just, a really beautiful edition of it. This, again, was either the day before or the day after I began recording that deck diary of that initiatory spread with Persephone. And as we were driving back in the car, I very much got this distinct message. Wow, we really creaking open there, aren't we? I got this very distinct message to open the book to certain pages. I got one page visually in my mind's eye and another auditory. So at first I was confused because I was like, second guessing and doubting, which one was it I'm supposed to look at? And then I just settled on, let me just look at them in order. And when I did, I don't know if I explained this well in the deck diary, but when I did, it was, again, very well tied into that reading. And the first page was the starting thread of a very prominent message within the plot. And the second page I was guided to was the culmination of that plot point. And I just thought that was so bizarrely fascinating. And this is where it ended. And the ending line that struck me most, "It isn't a quite dead garden," she cried out softly to herself. "Even if the roses are dead, there are other things alive." It gives me chills even to read it now because of how much that tied into the deeper things that were being brought up in all of this work. So I don't even know what to say about that, but I wanted to share it because that greatly influenced how I processed that reading. And it's also just a really beautiful copy from Barnes & Noble of The Secret Garden. So I look forward to rereading this maybe this spring. Kind of also in its way ties into Persephone with the garden theme. And, being able to look at this story that I grew up with as a kid from the adult perspective I have now, and understanding of myth and tying in themes in this story to the broader themes of life and perhaps even tarot, we'll see. But I wanted to mention it for that because it was sort of a pivot point for things. So the last thing I want to mention here in this portion of video are two decks that I got for working with Persephone, but that didn't really wind up being roped in. It would have been probably too many new decks. But one of them I haven't seen around much, and it's gorgeous, and it's indie, and it's also relatively affordable for an indie. So I wanted to show it. And that one is Walk Through the Eternal Gardens, which is an Oracle plus a Lenormand. And then also this deck, Journey of a Lonely Soul. And this card is the Rise of Persephone in this deck. So I felt called to get it when it was on sale. I was going to get this and Dark Mirror, but like I said, found out Dark Mirror was out of print, so I had to go find it somewhere else. And I didn't end up... I've pulled some cards from this to feel it out, you know, but it didn't wind up being... You know, it's not like stitching 2 oracles and a tarot was enough for me because they kind of covered the points they needed to cover, I felt like. But I don't know why I'm having such a strange and intense feeling of nostalgia at this moment, or deja vu, rather. Anyway, this deck, it's gorgeous. I think the artwork is evocative, is interesting, but I just haven't really dived into it. I've pulled from it here or there. I don't know exactly what place it's going to settle into in the practice. We'll see. I think it'll pop out into circulation when I'm ready to work with this. I'm not sure still how I feel about the guidebook. I don't know. If I ever feel the need to disregard a guidebook, I will. Actually, Tarot Obscuro, that one has a digital guidebook. I really didn't like some of the write-ups in there, just going to be honest. And it might have been part of what immediately turned me off, because some of the descriptions of the meanings of the cards were just, I did not understand. I just didn't get it, and it kind of put me in a weird place where I was like, I don't know that I'm going to get a deck where the images and like the intention of them just hits in a way that doesn't resonate for me. But, you know, I wound up moving past it, and who knows, maybe if I looked at those now, I'd feel differently. But at any rate, this deck's sort of similar. It just feels sometimes like parts of the guidebook, I'm like, I don't really know what that's trying to tell me. But I haven't worked with it a lot. I also tend to use guidebooks like this as a form of bibliomancy. So if I pull a card, maybe there's just a sentence or a phrase within a sentence, and that's really what I'm looking for, and it has nothing to do with the broader description of the card. And I let that be the case where it feels like that's what's happening. So I wanted to mention this one. And then let's get on to look at Walk Through the Eternal Gardens. And I think then we're gonna tap out and have a part 2 of this where I actually talk about practice stuff, because this is pretty long as it is. I don't want to cram that all into this video for you guys and have like a 2-hour thing. So this deck, I don't know how I found it. I saw it somewhere. The last I looked, there was like one video of someone talking about it, but it is beautiful. It's, I believe, a collage style deck. It's part Oracle, part Lenormand, like I said. So all these cards with the red banner and this style of artwork where there's a red figure, symbol, whatnot, are the Lenormand, whereas these cards are the Oracle. You could keep them separate. You know, it's a hefty deck with them mixed in for an Oracle deck. So you could, I don't know, you could probably separate them. I'm not familiar with Lenormand, and I'm still debating if I want to learn the system or if I want to let these symbols kind of become a thing for me in my own intuitive way. I haven't 100% decided. Also, some of the names are changed in the Lenormand, and the digital guidebook, because this doesn't have a physical guidebook, is, I think, in the process of being rewritten, and it kind of looks like it's been that way for a minute. So I don't know if that's still something she's working on or not. I really would love to see it, because the parts of it that are still written that can be seen really made me wish there was a physical guidebook, because I really enjoyed her writing. But we'll see. I might just work with it. You know, when I got it, I was like, maybe it'll be a good clarifier. I wasn't exactly sure, but I just thought aesthetically, in terms of theme and the artwork, it's like this Gothic garden situation. And yeah, I was like, that feels like a Persephone deck. So I went, I looked, I saw she had some copies marked down because of minor damage. I mean, look how beautiful these are. And so I got a copy. I can't remember. I mean, I don't know what the minor damage was. That always happens where I'm just like, this looks like a perfect copy to me, and I got it for like $5 or $10 less, so I'm jazzed. I think it was like $35 too, which, like I said, for an indie production, and it is a tuck box, but it's a very nicely made one. That's not an exorbitant price. So at any rate, this and the other artwork she has that pairs with it called Evolution, I wound up getting the small prints of, and oh yeah, look at that. I wound up getting these, and I have them on my altar because, again, with the themes of Persephone, demise, and evolution, I was like, yeah, I don't know if ever I was going to put artwork on my altar in working with Persephone. These just felt beautiful, and as well as the idea of bones tying into the work I'd been doing previously last summer around women who run with the wolves, and that the first chapter of that book, she's talking about La Loba and collecting the bones, the forgotten or lost bones of yourself. So all of it tied in so beautifully, so synchronistically. And this artwork is gorgeous. So I'm curious to see if perhaps spring, this is going to be more of a deck I work with. Also, sad note, my snake of 15 years passed away some weeks ago now. So yeah, when I say I've been continuously working through grief, I have been. So at any rate, I just wanted to show this one because I haven't seen it around. It's gorgeous. I'm tempted to learn Lenormand. I've looked into it a little bit. I might look into it some more and see. But like I said, she did change some of the names on the Lenormand cards. And so sometimes I'm not sure what they're referencing. And I kind of might just let my own system evolve out of this. I love this Illuminate card. And just to show you real quick, since we're doing the practice portion of all of this in a separate video, let me show you how this looks like the Tarot of Persephone's Garden, because that was my idea of how I'd work with this. We'll see though, because I could see this pairing with some other things I have. It also shuffles beautifully. It's a sort of linen, but it definitely is a different feeling linen than Tarot of Persephone's Garden. Wouldn't really know how to explain it other than to say, or to show, if I scan these through the light, you can maybe see the texture difference, that this one is sort of a more glossy situation and feels smoother in texture. But that's about as much as I can discern about cardstock in general. I do like a good cardstock, but I don't know a ton. But yeah, the Oracle card part of this has a lot of things like the elements, astrological signs, seasons, but it also does have these kinds of cards like worth. And then, of course, the Lenormand. But I do think they look quite nice together, paired up. We'll have to see how this ends up being a part of my practice. I'm not sure. The other types of oracles I usually would place in the center between two cards, I'm usually pulling those first as the context, or the, how should I say, like this is the thing we're looking at, and the tarot expands into the context of what that thing is manifesting as. Let's just go with that explanation for now. It kind of boils it down, I think. But yeah, this is like, for example, I think this music card is supposed to be the woman card, or I don't know Lenormand. So I might be forgetting, but I did look that up at one point because I was like, what is this music card in Lenormand? I'm curious. But yeah, isn't it beautiful? I totally want to try it with Botanica now that it's spring. It might be too much black floral jewelry on black floral jewelry, but at the same time, I really want to try that and see how they work together. We'll see. Perhaps when I do my spring deck list, we can give that a go and see how they look together. But yeah, that's basically been my practice, or at least the decks I've worked with. Like I said, there will be a part 2 of this where I discuss more how I practiced this winter season, what kinds of ways I was working through things, and how I actually worked with the cards, because that is something I want to share, but I know how fun it is to look and see what decks people have used or are planning to use. I like that kind of content too. So if you want to stick around for those types of videos and getting more into the practice of working with these particular decks, stay tuned, subscribe, drop a like and a comment. I would love to know what you think. And I guess I will catch you in the next one, because there was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. So we will just leave it there. Thank you for watching. And if you made it to the end, if there is a sun emoji, leave that down below. Just curious to see who might have gotten all the way here. This was a long journey. All right. See you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.